This is the Blood Red podcast from the Liverpool Echo, giving you the inside track on all the big talking points from Anfield.
Hello and welcome to a very special edition of the Blood Red podcast with me, Paul Gorst, who is standing in for Theo Squires and Ian Doyle on hosting duties today. But never fear, we do have a very special guest with us today, and those of us watching on YouTube will have already seen who it is. It is my former Echo colleague and current athletic scribe, James Pearce. James, good to have you on. You okay?
Thanks for having me, Gorst. Yeah, how are you?
Yeah, all good. Keeping busy as we are during the international break. But you are here to have a little natter about the Reds, but also to promote a very special offering from yourself. It is Walk On Inside Arne Slot's Liverpool, your brand new book.
It is, yeah. Came out only about coming up to a fortnight ago. So it's been a kind of bit of a step into the unknown. First book. Thought that the time was right especially after such an incredible season last season, and that kind of transition from Klopp to Slot. So decided to bite the bullet and spend the summer doing that.
Yeah, well, I remember the summer when we were in Japan and Hong Kong, and it was, James, I'm at the bar, do you want a beer? No, I've got 300 words to bash out for the book. And it really, for a bit, it felt like it took over a lot of your, obviously you're doing the job day to day, but also a lot of your free time suddenly became book time.
Yeah. I must admit, if I'd had a crystal ball and I could have seen that it would be the busiest transfer window in Liverpool's history, I probably wouldn't have said yes when the publisher asked me. But in my head, it seemed like a good idea because I thought, well, once the celebrations have kind of gone down and there'll be a bit of a lull and a bit of downtime. But yeah, it didn't really pan out like that. So it was a bit of a crazy kind of few months just with trying to keep on top of the day job and then burning the midnight oil, doing the book, and then somehow managed to come back from Tokyo with pneumonia after the tour, which wasn't ideal because I did think that was getting close to the deadline. So I was thinking the publisher's going to think I'm like, it's the equivalent of the dogs eating my homework, telling them, but I'm going to be a bit late handing this in. But yeah, it was. I kind of thought about it, doing it There's been a few recent years, obviously with Klopp going. I thought about doing it then, and the publisher would contact me a few years go about a different type of book, but it just never. It just felt like when do you ever get the time to do it? But I kind of reached a point where I thought, well, if I don't say yes sooner or later, then they'll stop asking. So just bite the bullet and do it. And it was probably the hardest thing I've ever done, actually. But it was, it felt like it was worth it in the end.
Obviously, it's with HarperCollins, who the publishers. Did they approach you when it looked like the writing was on the wall for Liverpool to win the league, or was it sort of in motion long before anyone sort of predicted it?
No, it was they'd initially kind of contacted me probably around kind of February, March of the season before, when after Klopp had announced that he was leaving and said, how do you feel about doing a book on the Klopp era? But the timescale was so tight that I just thought, and obviously knowing how busy the next few months were going to be with with the managerial search and everything else on top of then the transfer window, I just thought, no, I can't commit to that. So then they got back in contact. Kind of, it was like late January, early February, where I think by then most people knew that barring a dramatic turn of events, Liverpool would be winning it. And it just seemed a bit more doable in terms of the timescale because that was like February time when we kind of agreed on it. And then I had until like the middle of August because obviously there's a process where you have to go through after you've submitted it, when then legal checks and everything else, where it takes a number of weeks before they can even think about sending it to be published. So, but it was with that kind of time scale, I just thought actually that's I kept working it out with like how many days have I got to hand it in and how many words are left, and then doing the calculation of like, okay, well that's 3,000 words a day. That's just about it. I just started to worry in like July when I think it was up to like 6,000 words a day, and that was when I knew it was going to be a bit of a battle.
Yeah, I mean the tagline is Inside Arne Slot's Liverpool, so it's documenting the historic season really, and the changeover that happened at the club, certainly front of house. But to go back to where this all starts, essentially is to November 2023 when Jurgen Klopp tells Fenway Sports Group of his decision to step away. I remember hearing from Klopp about that decision might have been the day it was announced, and we were in the press conference when he said, he was having a meeting about pre-season tours, and he just started to think, well, what if I don't have to be here, type of thing. And that was a pivotal moment, really. It allowed the club, 6 months to get the decision right, to do the handover on their terms, and that sort of sowed the initial seeds for what was to come.
Yeah. And I thought, when I was trying to kind of thinking about how to kind of structure the book, I thought, well, what I didn't want to do is I didn't want to do a book that was essentially just a diary of a season and kind of like, start it from when, Slot walks in and almost do it chronologically. I thought, well, such a big part of it for me, of the story, what made last season so special, is how the club and how FSG handled that transition. Because you mentioned obviously when Jurgen made his announcement in the January, and of course the owners had known since the November. There was this like general sense of kind of fear and trepidation amongst the fan base of like, what on earth does the future look like without Klopp? Because I don't think it's too big a leap to say he's probably the most transformative figure in Liverpool's history since Bill Shankly. When you look at where Liverpool were at when he walked in, where they were at, when he walked away. So it was like, what does the future look like without him? I think, obviously rival supporters were rubbing their hands in glee in terms of, well, that's the demise of Liverpool sorted. It'll be, Ferguson and Man United revisited. So for me, that was like a big part to, the first chapter is essentially, what was it about Klopp that made him so special? Why was there that fear of like what the future would look like without him? And then obviously that then leads into kind of how they handled that transitional period. And it was interesting speaking to people for the book, because obviously, it's like you make a long list of people you'd love to speak to, some more realistic than others, some are willing to chat on the record, others will just chat off the record. And speaking to people, they said that, even though I think he did a pretty good job of hiding it, behind the scenes, people at the club in senior positions first started to think everything wasn't quite right around kind of Christmas 2022 when, if you remember rightly, when Liverpool were in Dubai. For that training camp, and of course everything around that time as well, kind of Julian Ward had announced that he'd be stepping down as sporting director not long after Michael Edwards had left. Mike Gordon had taken a step back briefly whilst FSG considered possibly selling the club. So kind of people said to me, like, Klopp was quite isolated, and he had so much, he was like the only constant, and he had so much kind of pressure on his shoulders that there was almost this feeling of like, people thinking, well, everything's not quite right here. We might have to consider the possibility that, this is almost the beginning of the end, if you like. And then, of course, it doesn't help the fact that season on the pitch is such a struggle, 22-23. And then I think he reaches a point in that, the end of the season where I think if he was doing solely what was best for him, he probably would have walked away then. But he did just feel this huge duty to like put things back on track. And he knew that because of his pulling power, he'd be better placed to oversee that midfield rebuild and attract players than maybe a new, less experienced manager. And he also, as it was explained to me, it was almost like the mindset was, well, if this goes well and I get Liverpool back in the Champions League, get them back challenging for trophies, I can walk off into the sunset with my head held high. Yeah. And if it goes badly, then I'll have to step down, because he kind of knew that he was never going to be sacked. Yeah, and they took the time with the decision, didn't they? With Slot, they initially enticed Michael Edwards back into a brand new role. What is his job title? The CEO of football, isn't it? At FSG, and then that leads on to the headhunting of Richard Hughes at Bournemouth, who's obviously worked together quite a lot in their Portsmouth days, and then the exhaustive work to identify the Klopp successor, which Slot wins out. And I think one of the things that Slot was seemingly struck by was the fact that, I think he might have said this to us at some point as well, that the club made him feel wanted. It wasn't like he's on a short list of 2 or 3. It was very much, you are our man, and this is why we think you'll be a success. And he was sort of quite receptive to that. Yeah, and I think that was the big difference for him. I think he'd been a little bit stung by some of those discussions he'd had with clubs previously, where I think it was well documented he came close to getting the Tottenham job. Less well documented that Chelsea were very keen on him as well. But in both those occasions, it was essentially, right, you show us why we should be employing you. Where the big difference when Richard Hughes turned up on his doorstep was, Richard Hughes was armed with a dossier that basically said, this is why we want you. Because Slot didn't want to be part of some like beauty parade where it was you tell us why we should be going for you, and Liverpool had left no stone unturned, and right down to the fact that Julian Ward, who'd obviously come back on board as technical director, had I think under the guise of going around Europe looking at academy facilities, I think he was actually there also to look at academy facilities, because of course as we now know, they're about to spend £20 million on redoing the academy. But of course, there was ulterior motive as well in terms of speaking to people at Feyenoord about Slot, and right down to kind of, how does he, not just relationships with players, but how does he treat other people around the building? What's the atmosphere like with him at the helm? And then, of course, talking the book about the data analysis plays a huge part as well in terms of, it was very much a decision where everything aligned in terms of the data pointed to Slot, the character references pointed to Slot. When they met him, the dynamic straight away between Richard Hughes and Slot, it just felt, this is going to work. And as you said, it was, they didn't rush into anything because they also felt it was so important to get the structure in place before they employed a head coach. And of course, key to that was getting Michael Edwards back. It's there's some stuff in there where they didn't. It was described to me as there was no plan B. It was plan A was get Michael Edwards back, and if that didn't work, just try plan A again,
get him back
again, and just do whatever it takes. And essentially, in the end, of course, Mike Gordon offers Michael Edwards his own job and says, I've been looking to kind of ease some of my responsibilities. You can run the entire football operations, and that was a kind of enough to kind of convince Michael Edwards to come back on board. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting was that, of course, Richard Hughes had long since handed in his notice at Bournemouth, and before I kind of did the book, I never really quite understood that in terms of that felt like a real leap of faith in terms of if Michael Edwards wasn't sure he was going to come back to Liverpool, then almost like what was Richard Hughes' mindset handing in his notice at Bournemouth? But I was told that essentially they had this like real desire to work together. They obviously had that friendship going back 20 odd years to their time together at Portsmouth, and how essentially Michael Edwards had said to Richard Hughes, you've almost done everything you can at Bournemouth. Your time is now to you're destined for bigger and better things. And he said, if come the end of the season, he said either one or two things. One, I'll be in charge of the football operations at a club and you'll be my sporting director. He said, or if I'm still working for Ludonautics, the advisory business, he said, I will be recommending you to clubs who frequently come to me asking me for advice. So yeah, and I think once Michael Edwards had said yes to Mike Gordon, his first phone call was to Richard Hughes to say, it's I'm going back. It's Liverpool. Are you interested? And it was an instant yes.
Yeah. We were there, weren't we, for the press conference at the start of the summer, when it was an unusual one where Slot was introduced alongside Richard Hughes, and there was the slight tweaking of the job title. Slot is not the manager; he is the head coach, and obviously Richard Hughes is the sporting director, who I don't think we've heard from since on the record, but it was a chance to get him in front of the likes of us and for people to ask the questions, and it very much marked, a line in the sand. This is the new era, this is the new leadership team, and we're going from here.
Yeah. And I think it was, part of the thinking was that it's probably not healthy to have so much responsibility lying in the hands of one person, and that's kind of borne out by the fact that Klopp was very clear, wasn't he? I think everyone was looking for other reasons, but it was like he just said, I just don't have the energy, and I think there's almost like an inevitability probably when someone's been in charge for that a length of time and had that success, that you're going to become more and more powerful and influential. But it was like his responsibilities stemmed such a wide spectrum of areas that there was this feeling of actually it's that's not the right thing to do. They never wanted, like, not that you could have found another Klopp, but that was just, they basically, the structure they assembled was completely and utterly different. And it was all about, actually, if we get the structure right with the expertise, with obviously, not just Michael Edwards, but Julian Ward coming back, obviously Richard Hughes, David Woodfine coming back as assistant sporting director, and then the other, appointments around them. And in fact, if you kind of empower the experts at the club, whether that's, on the medical side or the sports science side, in the data side, and it just, you can then create a situation where the head coach can just focus solely on what he's best at. And of course, that was the motivation for Slot. And obviously we were both in that opening press conference where, of course everyone was asking him about transfers, but he was very open and honest straight away, wasn't he? He was just like, no, I really like this squad. It was, and kind of, maybe at the time we probably thought, oh, he's just saying that. Surely, like all managers, you want to put your own stamp on it. But he was genuine. He'd obviously spent a lot of time analysing the players that he would be inheriting. I know his attention to detail was such that he was even, watching back every training session, going back months and months. And yeah, his kind of assessment was actually, why, this is a squad who came pretty close last season before tailing off in the last kind of 6-7 weeks of the season. But they're all a year, those younger players are now a year older, more experienced, more battle hardened. And I know from, some of the players speak about it in the book that although kind of maybe externally there was this feeling of, well, top 4 would be brilliant, that's got to be the target, bound to be a period of transition. Slot in those first meetings was like, this is why you finished third last season. These are the things that have to change if we're going to finish first.
Yeah, I mean, we were there, weren't we, in Philadelphia for open training, and you see him really getting to work, actually. Some of those open training sessions can be a little bit of a, just going through the motions for the cameras before the real work gets to start. But it was around about an hour in the certain heat of Philadelphia, and, we shot and kill him with passes, and clearly there was a new game plan he was trying to introduce, a bit more possession-based, a bit less, or a bit more risk-averse, shall we say, choose your forward passes wisely, and ultimately that was the style that, helped Liverpool go on and really fly out the blocks, which, what was it, 12 wins out of 13 or 14, something like that, and, really sort of set the tone for the season to follow.
Yeah, we were both in that first press conference in Pittsburgh when we were, Curtis Jones spoke, and it was, and I think, he was so enthusiastic about the start of the Slot era that, some people kind of interpreted that as a pop at Klopp, which I know that kind of hurt Curtis, because he subsequently said on the record, that really wasn't the motivation whatsoever. He said, I owe Klopp everything in terms of the influence he's had in terms of launching my career. He just said it was just an observation that this change in style where, of course, the midfield under Klopp had been very much about feeding the front three as soon as you possibly can. It was just, as you said, more about control, more about possession. It was more about, keeping hold of it and waiting for the right pass rather than just shifting it. And of course, we all know that suits Curtis down to the ground. So it was, I think there was a few eyebrows raised at his comments, but it just kind of underlined how Slot was able to get buy-in very, very quickly from, and I think part of that was probably testament to the culture of the dressing room that Klopp had left behind in terms of, yes, full of elite players, some of the best in the world, but also very open to kind of like, okay, give this guy, let's see what he, if he can help elevate my game even further, then brilliant. And so that was a key part of it. And I think it also helped Slot in a way that, those first few weeks, he did have a very young squad to work with. And obviously it was almost by the point that some of the real big names returned after their international commitments and then their holidays and stuff. It was like a lot of the new way of doing things was kind of already embedded. And they just kind of bought into that completely. But yeah, it was, I think one of the real culture shocks for them was just the sheer number of meetings early on, because, it was just something they hadn't been used to in terms of, not just team meetings, but back four meetings, midfield meetings, individual meetings, really like analysing bits from training in terms of, what could have been done better, what was good. Always the Slot way is always to whatever you're trying to get across, you always end on a positive. You always show a few of the best moments at the end to ensure the player goes off feeling good about himself. But it was, I think Mo Salah talked about it, didn't he? That I think it was one of those early warm-ups before a session where he just he admitted himself he was going through the motions a little bit, and Slot kind of pulled him to one side and said, no, you can't do that, because look at these young players behind you in the warm-up. They look at you taking it easy and think, and it just kind of sent a message that, I think this guy is onto everything. Like he's watching and he's demanding the highest of standards. And of course, because then they see the results on the pitch in terms of the way the season starts, that helps as well, because we know what it's like. When a player sees that, what the manager is talking to you about all week actually bears out on the pitch on a Saturday or Sunday, it makes you think, actually, this guy knows exactly what he's on about.
Yeah, I mean, with Salah, he has one of the arguably, could be the best season of his Liverpool career, wasn't it? Everyone remembers that 44-goal first season, but Liverpool ultimately don't win anything. He goes and scores 29 Premier League goals. Liverpool win the Premier League, handsomely. He sweeps the board with the awards and so on. I think one of the key things for him was he decided not to go on Egypt duty in favour of a full pre-season at Liverpool last summer on the Slot, so he could get to know the manager, like you say, get to work with him. And there's that clip of him, isn't there, where I think he missed the first day, but he's back, say, he start training on the Monday and he's in on the Tuesday, and he goes and wins that 6-minute race. He goes and blitzes Sepp Vandenberg, and it was a real sort of, I'm here for you, I'm one of the leaders, and I'm going to give me all. And like you say, that buy-in that a lot of these, massive players had, which ultimately helps with the results that Liverpool got off to. Yeah.
I mean, he returned in unbelievable shape, and I think that was the best season of his Liverpool career. I know. Obviously, the numbers were higher in that first season, but you think about in terms of being a complete footballer, in terms of not just the goals but the assists as well, and just the team play, and it's obviously he talked, didn't he, about he'd said to Slot, if you can kind of lift some of those defensive responsibilities off me, then I'll deliver those numbers in the final third. So there was that kind of risk and reward kind of balance to be struck, where of course it's been a big topic of debate again this season, because the numbers aren't as good. He's not influencing games to the same degree in the final third, so then people are focusing more on the defensive side of his game, because Liverpool aren't controlling games as much. They aren't, dominating. So, but yeah, that was, I mean, Salah just, the standards that were set last season were crazy. And it was, obviously there's a chapter in the book on the three contract sagas in terms of Salah, Van Dijk and Alexander-Arnold. And again, what I thought was quite interesting was, he gives that interview, doesn't he, on the pitch at Old Trafford in, I think it was early September, when, emphatic Liverpool win, and he kind of just nonchalantly drops in, was probably my last season at Liverpool. I might not come back here again. And I think that sets alarm bells ringing. But in fact, for people like Michael Edwards and Richard Hughes, and probably Slot as well, that was like their first sign, publicly or privately, that actually they saw that as a positive, because it was like, well, this guy wants to stay. He hasn't actually, I think there was a degree of, well, let's just wait and see how the dynamic works with, the new manager and how, but for him to come out and say that, they were like, well, that's, and then it, obviously we were both there, weren't we, at Southampton, when Salah came out with some standout quotes about, I'm probably more out than in, and talking about, his he went very public, didn't he, in terms of his frustration at times. But again, underlying it was the fact, well, this guy really wants to stay. He really, yes, he wants a contract that kind of rewards his status as still one of the best players in world football, but he doesn't want to go anywhere. So yeah, it was, and of course, with the sheer number of goals and assists he provides, in the end, it's an absolute no-brainer for Liverpool in terms of keeping him.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the chapter on the contracts, because it was it had the potential to derail Liverpool's season, really, with the three highest profile players in the squad constantly getting asked about it. I thought Slot handled that masterfully, really. Almost by the end of it, reporters were almost asking apologetically, is there an update? No, okay, let's move on. And it could have been a real issue, but it wasn't. Virgil obviously speaks to us after every game, doesn't he? And it speaks so often that he wasn't getting asked every game. It was almost like, well, it's been 3 weeks, is it fair game to ask again? Trent spoke after the Bournemouth game, was it, at Anfield in September, and then sort of went to ground, and then obviously Mo had a few things to get off his chest at St Mary's and the team in that reign. But the way that was orchestrated behind the scenes, obviously Alexander Arnold had his own ambitions and moves on, but Liverpool retained the captain and the top scorer. You have to say now, with hindsight, it was superbly executed the way it was handled.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, and I know from speaking to the different players' camps for the book that they did really appreciate the way that Slot handled it publicly, because you're right. Sometimes he'd use a bit of humour just to kind of diffuse anything. I think off the back of Salah's comments after that game at Southampton, I think the next press conference, Slot said, well, in terms of my lineup, he's more in than out.
Yeah,
and it was, and I think there was another time when he joked about, well, it's probably going to cost the owners a few extra pounds. The fact that because he keeps on scoring these goals, his wage demands are only going to. It was just this way he had of managing to diffuse things and avoid any unwanted headlines, and so yeah, he did handle what of course results help. We know what it's like in terms of even this season, because Konaté's form's not been great. It suddenly, is that the contract situation preying on his mind? But of course, I think for those three players, Salah, Van Dijk and Alexander-Arnold, all three performed at such a high level and were so influential in that title-winning season that at no point could you level at any of them the idea that, that was the contract sagas was having, an impact. I know Trent's slightly different because, you obviously have the game, against Manchester United when... that was off the back of a lot of speculation that he'd already made his mind up. But I think in general, and Slot went on record himself, you can't kind of we can't be too revisionist about it, that, Trent still did play a big part in Liverpool winning that title. And I think in terms of the Salah Van Dijk, situations, I think, it almost suited the club, as it turned out, to kind of let it drag on as long as it did, because it kind of gave them almost like an entire season of data to kind of back up that decision that actually, we believe that these guys are still going to deliver at the highest level for another 2 years, where if they'd made that decision in the September or something, who knows what might have, what you might have regretted that come the April. But it was, but I think it helped Liverpool, and and I'm sure this would have been something that Richard Hughes and Michael Edwards talked about, was they knew that Salah and Van Dijk were both desperate to stay. That made the dynamic very different to, say, the Alexander-Arnold one, where I think probably from January onwards, deep down the club knew that he would be moving on. It was only in the March international break that Trent actually officially informed Slot and his agent informed Richard Hughes. But of course, it was just so different. Trent being significantly younger, the bright lights of Real Madrid calling. I think he'd obviously made that decision that he wanted to move on and pursue a new challenge. But yeah, I think as a whole, it was handled by Liverpool as well as they could have done. Yeah,
and I think if you speak to every Premier League player who's won the title over the course of the last 30 odd years, I think privately they give you a game or a result when they started to believe that the title is going to be mine, is going to be ours. I remember speaking to Trent after when they won the league in 2020, and he said Leicester on Boxing Day was probably the one when they started to really believe, and then they beat Manchester United maybe a month later. One of the things that jumped out to me in the book is the Manchester City win in February.
Yeah.
That was the result where, of course, people aren't saying it, publicly or whatever, but that was the one when they started to think something very special is coming down the line here.
Yeah. There was a nice anecdote that someone told me that when they got back to the changing room, Rodri, who of course was out injured at the time, was waiting outside the away dressing room at the Etihad to basically congratulate every Liverpool player back into the dressing room, and it was someone said to me, it just felt like kind of almost like a kind of handing over of the in terms of, you know, fair play. You know, I think Liverpool went 11 points clear that day, so it was, you know, and of course the away end kind of, that was the day when they kind of burst into, you know, now you're going to believe us, we're going to win the league. But it was, you know, and of course you're never going to get anyone go on the record saying things like that at the time. But yeah, deep down in the dressing room, the senior players felt that was when they started to kind of really think, yeah, no one's going to stop us now. Because I think it was just the manner of it as well. I mean, it just, you know, I felt that was one of the real standout games tactically from Slot. Into, you know, if you remember rightly, Liverpool only had about 36% possession or something, but it felt like a masterclass in terms of, you know, taking control first half, getting that 2-0 lead, and then almost saying to City, fine, you can have the ball, you know, break us down. And, you know, and despite, you know, there was some, I think some people got excited about, you know, Doku and his take-ons or something that day, but none of it led to anything. I mean, obviously Doku is a different proposition this time around, as we saw a couple of weeks ago. But yeah, City barely laid a glove on Liverpool that day, and it just felt symbolic as well. The fact that I think it was Liverpool's first league double over City since 2015-16. And when you think of those battles, you know, during the kind of the Klopp Guardiola era, for Liverpool to go there, you know, put on a show and to go a big step closer to winning the league, yeah, that was huge. And of course, you know, you had that kind of the abiding image was Szoboszlai at the final whistle, like just lying on the grass. You know, that just epitomised the kind of the shift that they'd put in.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is almost unfairly thrown at Slot of late is that he only won the league because it was the team that Klopp had left to him. But you look at some of the improvements in the individuals. You've spoken a lot about Salah there, but you know, someone like Ryan Gravenberch was on the fringes, wasn't he, in Klopp's final season? You know, basically playing in Europa League games, and then he becomes the sort of fulcrum of the midfield. Young player of the year, of course, on the back of those performances. You know, players like him, you know, really sort of stepped up to the fore, and you know, have since developed into, you know, difficult few weeks aside, you know, real sort of top class players for Slot.
Yeah. I think, you know, it is ridiculous, some of the rewriting of history when, you know, because Liverpool have had a ropey couple of months, it suddenly becomes, well, you know, the suggestion that Slot just kind of turned up and said, well, just do whatever the last fella told you to do, and we'll hope for the best. You don't have to really dig too deep to think of examples that you just rattled off a few there in terms of the way that he changed things, and of course it doesn't. The idea that he just won it with someone else's team. Klopp didn't. You know, he hadn't won it since 2019-20. So you know, it wasn't like it was Liverpool were retaining the title. They set a consistency level that we hadn't seen since, you know, they'd last won the league. So and Gravenberch was a perfect example of that. I mean, I'd have to hold my hands up and say that when they missed out on Zubimendi, I thought that's going to cost Liverpool, especially when it became very clear that they weren't going to go after a plan B. And I just thought I didn't know Ryan Gravenberch had that in him to be the best holding midfielder in the Premier League as he was last season. That was a masterstroke to basically, you know, and again, like from what I was told, there was this calmness to Slot after they missed out on Zubimendi. It was like, okay, well, actually, you know, they were, you know, there were other options out there on the market, but it was like, actually, no, I think I'd rather just go with Gravenberch and play in as a 6. And then you think about, you know, playing Luis Diaz as a number 9 for a chunk of the season, and you know, someone like Szoboszlai who'd lost his way towards the end of the final season under Klopp. Even, you know, Konate has not been at the same level this season, but he was outstanding last season. And again,
Gakpo for me as well.
Gakpo as well. 100%. It was, you know, there was a lot of players there who were kind of reinvigorated by new methods, you know, a new way of doing things, and you know, and also, you know, he had, you know, it was remarkable really in terms of the fitness record when you look at the number of days lost to injuries compared to what it was the year before, and you know, of course, Ruben Peters and you know the medical staff obviously integral to that, but it just kind of it became a much more kind of collegiate way of working rather than kind of under Klopp. It was very much kind of, whatever he says goes. It was more of a kind of, if you've got an expert in a particular field, then why would you not let that person leads in that area? Because that has to be the best way of doing things.
Yeah, and I think supporters were extremely lucky last season in that, sort of how special the season it was to get the game against Spurs when they only needed a point to go and win the title in late April, and they hammered them. It was a 5-1 in the end, and then they get a bit of a month-long victory lap. Chelsea away end, the Brighton away end, and then the big day itself against Crystal Palace. What are some of your memories of that remarkable month, sort of late April to late May? Because some of the best days fans have ever had, I guess.
Yeah. It's funny, isn't it? Because I think it seems like such a modern day thing to like. It almost feels like you can't enjoy something. It's almost like, well, what next? Like almost like it's like now it's almost like, well, Liverpool are terrible champions because they might not retain the title, and it's like, well, whatever happens this season doesn't change. Whatever happens this season doesn't change the fact that those were some of the greatest days of my life. In that game against Tottenham, it's because when I think back to being there when Liverpool lifted the trophy behind closed doors in 2020, and it was such a weird feeling being like, I don't know, it was probably only 300 people inside the ground that night, and you're thinking, in 30 years of waiting for this, I never ever thought that this, the idea that this would be the scenario. So to flip that around, and for 5 years later to just be able to have the honour of being inside Anfield and looking around at the absolute euphoria and what that meant to like 60-odd thousand people, and knowing that millions and millions of others around the world, what it meant to them, and seeing like the generations of people going to the games, and 35 years since, and even I was thinking back to I remember Liverpool winning the league in 1990, but it never triggered scenes like that because it was routine. It was like, well, it'll happen again next year, and it'll happen again the year after. So it was. That game against Tottenham was, I think the trophy lift day was special in a different way. But I think in terms of raw emotion, nothing comes close to that Tottenham game. And then you have this, almost like a month-long victory lap then, don't you? Where, it still makes me smile when I think if someone had said after Klopp had announced he was leaving that, his successor would be partying in Ibiza with Dean Gaffney 3 weeks before the end of the season, you'd have been carted off somewhere, wouldn't you? No one would have believed you. And obviously the players have their social in Dubai, I know there's a school of thought that should they have just put the foot to the floor and just got over 90 points and tried to finish with a flourish, but it really didn't matter. They got the job done with 4 games to go, and I think they thoroughly deserved that. And it was just so special to be able to kind of. I just remember leaving the ground actually after the Tottenham game, and it was because of obviously doing the writing stuff. I think we recorded a podcast straight after. It's been like 3 hours after the game. And like Walton Brett Road, which
still going strong,
it was ridiculous. Like it was like the fireworks going off and the flares and the things. And like police would try and like reopen in the road, but it was like they had no chance because there were thousands of people, and that just like rammed it home that this is the kind of day that we're never ever going to forget.
Yeah. Just before we touch on what is the final chapter of the book, just wanted to ask about your thoughts on Slot as a person, really. Obviously, you had a chance to sit down with him at the back end of last season, and I've found him very affable, charming. He's a lot harder to get under the skin of than Jurgen was at times, which makes it easier sometimes when you have to ask maybe a difficult question. But how have you found him in your dealings with him during the course of the last 18 months?
Yeah, I think a very different character, isn't he, to Jurgen in terms of Jurgen's obviously a lot more emotional, and I'd say probably from a journalistic point of view, probably you'd sometimes go to a Jurgen Klopp press conference and you'd come away thinking, well, there's about 6 or 7 different lines that you could do there, and there'd always be some funny quotes, or he'd have some dig at, kickoff times or TNT.
FIFA get a kick in or
yeah. And it was, but I'd say Slot is a lot more kind of careful in terms of he doesn't really pick battles, does he? Really, in terms of even when he's asked about fixture congestion or the 12:30s or something. I think his mindset is very different in terms of we're not going to change it, so why moan about it? Because almost if you start moaning about it, you put a seed of doubt maybe in players' minds that it's an excuse, and you don't want to do that. I think he's kind of got that kind of Dutch bluntness to him in terms of. I think for me he's at his most interesting when he's talking about the tactical side of things, because I think sometimes he almost can't help himself on the tactical side of things, because he obviously. He
lives and breathes it.
He lives and breathes it. I find it intriguing when he's kind of explaining, something on the tactical side of things. Quite guarded, I'd say, on certain things like injuries is one obvious one. Like obviously you're almost wasting your time if you ask him anything transfer related or contract related. The shutters come down, but yeah, I've been really impressed. From just when you think, I know Feyenoord are a big club in Holland, but the step up in terms of, just the sheer amount of media duties he has to do, how, every word you say as a Liverpool manager gets picked apart, even more so when results aren't great, the scrutiny and the pressure that comes with it. I'm struggling to think of times when he's kind of, when you've come away from a press conference thinking, he shouldn't have said that, or he didn't handle that too well. I mean, I think back to last season, and obviously we've got Forest coming up this weekend, and people will point back to maybe when Liverpool lost at home to Forest, and I think he said something like, Liverpool shouldn't be losing to a team like Forest, who aren't going to be, probably not going to be in the top 10 or something, and because Forest then do much better than expected, that's kind of used as a bit of a stick to beat him with. But at the time, what he said was that no one expected Forest to do what they did, and that was a really bad setback for Liverpool at the time. So, yeah, I've been really impressed by how he's handled everything that comes with being Liverpool manager. And I also just. Obviously, he loses his rag, doesn't he, at Goodison in that? That was, and for me, that was like, he is human after all. The fact that there is, because sometimes he manages to stay so calm that you think, surely you're going to lose your rag at some point, and then that was the eruption, wasn't it? That we belatedly saw, but yeah, he's a real leader, and that's why there's such a knee-jerk reaction in modern football these days, and you think people questioning him already after 11 games this season. It's I know the owners have still got absolutely complete and utter faith and support in him, and rightly so, because what he's done what he did in his first year in charge was extraordinary. And yes, it's been a tough start to this season, but we can all point to lots and lots of reasons for that.
Yeah, and the final chapter of the book is dedicated to Diogo. Obviously, we get the horrendous, tragic news in early July that he died in a car accident with his brother. It's still being felt at the club today, isn't it? Just last night we had Andy Robertson, fresh from qualifying with Scotland for the first World Cup since 1998, and he's revealing how much he was still in bits. Was it yesterday morning? Thinking about the conversations he had with Diogo and how close he was with him, and there's so many at the club who were good friends, and we've heard stories privately, haven't we, about what he used to do sort of behind the scenes and how good a friend he was to everyone, really. When did that decision come in to change essentially the ending of the book, and when did it become apparent that you were going to dedicate it to Diogo and his memory? Yeah,
it was I I think everyone, it kind of hit me hard, like when we start of July, and just having, just from a professional capacity, having had dealings with him, and then of course after, you're thinking, well, what do I do now in terms of the book, in terms of it's not strictly part of the season, because of course it happens in July, but it's like it's just going to be so intrinsically linked to to that achievement of winning the league, and of course the contribution he made along the way. So it just felt, for a start, it kind of led to kind of the title of the book being tweaked a little bit, because I think at one point it was going to be Walk On, how Arne Slot led Liverpool to Premier League glory, and it was like, well, it doesn't feel to me right to do it just as a tale of triumph now. I think you have to incorporate the unbelievable heartache and the tragedy that everyone faced going into the following season. So yeah, it just felt like the right thing to do to rejig it and dedicate that last chapter to kind of Diogo's memory in terms of what was it about him, speaking to people about what was it about him that made him so special, because he was universally loved by players and staff, and and I think his character had been kind of formed by his journey to get to the top. The fact that I remember one of the first interviews I did with him, he said, I was still paying to play football at the age of 14. He was like, he'd been kind of overlooked by all the big Portuguese clubs, and he did it the hard way in terms of, and I think you could see that in the way he played football as well, that that tenacious quality of like, he had the bit between his teeth and was, he would give everything for the cause, because it meant so much to him to have got to where he had done, and he fully appreciated everything that came with that. You think of the charities and the things like the mental health initiatives that he supported. He was always giving back, and so I felt it was important to kind of paint a picture of why this did hit so many people so hard. And then also, it was tricky, because obviously you don't want to impinge on people's grief, but trying to find out how Liverpool handled those first few weeks, because it's as a sporting director and as a football manager, these are things you never ever envisage being faced with, and I know that for staff at the club, Richard Hughes and Arne Slot were already held in high regard, but it went another level in terms of how they almost had to part their own grief to mastermind how the club got through that period. And I think sometimes people forget just how raw it still is, because you referenced there Andy Robertson's interview. I think the players have, a few of them have really talked about it, because it is a very personal thing, and they probably know that some people will the accusation, which I think is horrendous, is it's an excuse. We didn't hear about this when Liverpool were winning. Well, I think people have been talking about it all season, and it's a process that anyone who knows who ever lost anyone that they loved, it's the idea that 3 or 4 months down the line, you just flick a switch and everything's okay again, just doesn't stack up with reality. So yeah, it felt like the kind of right place to end the book was the opening game of this season, with those incredibly poignant scenes against Bournemouth, with Mo Salah stood in front of the Kop with tears in his eyes, clapping as the Jota song was sung, and kind of no one really knowing what the future had in store, because it is unprecedented, isn't it, for an elite team like Liverpool to have lost such a loved figure, and at the moment, I think there's still a lot of uncertainty of what is in store this season, because it's bound to have an ongoing impact. Yeah,
we spoke to Gakpo, didn't we, in Japan about. I think it was the first time a player had spoken about the impact of what had only been a few weeks at the time, and if I'm right in thinking, before the interview started, did we actually say, "Are you okay speaking about Diogo?" And he was very sort of stoic in what he said, and from what we gathered after it, we'd been a real sort of source of comfort for so many people. Sort of big, strong, striker who people can lean on, and it felt like everyone closed ranks, and there was a real sort of unity within the squad. But there's no sort of blueprint for mapping your way through this sort of stuff, and not many teams have ever had to deal with anything like that. And I guess it's something that is going to be maybe a talking point certainly for the rest of this season.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I remember we had that conversation before the interview. It was like, well, we should ask him to see, because it's such a personal thing, isn't it? Some people would want to talk about it to honour kind of his memory. Other people would find it too difficult, and of course you respect that either way. And then it's almost, I find it almost quite awkward in a situation like that, where you're almost asking someone about something which is so big and has such a, an impact, and then it's like, anyway, let's go back to it. And it's like football football just seems so meaningless in comparison, doesn't it? But it's like, like trying to get back to a semblance of normality is a process for all those players and the staff. And I don't think, I think everyone will have noticed this season, Lee Richardson, the psychologist, being a lot more visible on match days and being available to players and staff. And, there's still counsellors that people can turn to, that resource is there. Of course, Bill Bygroves, the long-serving club chaplain, these people have been, absolutely huge, because it's, it's bound to affect different people in different ways at different times. And but yeah, I thought the way that Slot handled the immediate aftermath. I mean, I think back to that interview he gave just before the opening friendly at Preston, where he said his message to the players had been kind of, just do what Diogo would have done. Be genuine. That was his greatest quality. Was what you saw is what you get. You don't have to hide anything. We're one big family that, if you feel able to train, then great. If you don't feel up to it, that's absolutely fine. No one's being judged. Everyone does everything at their own pace, and if you need help, we're going to make sure there's the network of professional people around to give you that help. So yeah, it's just it obviously a horrendous situation, but as has happened previously in Liverpool's history, in tough times, people come together, and you find strength from that kind of that kind of bond and unity, which, of course, you think of those scenes after the game at Preston, in terms of, the tears in the stands and on the pitch, in terms of that was the kind of first step, wasn't it, to a semblance of normality again. Yeah,
very poignant chapter to end the book on, but one that is, it just feels right, doesn't it? Because like you say, you can't sort of talk about last season without the impact of Diogo's passing and what he meant to everyone at the club. But James, thank you very much for your time. Walk On Inside Arne Slot's Liverpool is out now. Perfect Christmas present, I'd suggest. Thank you very much for coming in, and I'm sure we'll get you back on a pod sometime soon.
Thanks for having me. Cheers, Gorsty.
Thank you very much. We will be back on Friday, we'll be in for our normal, regular scheduled Blood Red podcast, previewing Saturday's visit from Nottingham Forest, and of course Arne Slot's Friday press conference. So please join us then. I'm not sure if Ian Doyle is with us or Theo Squires, but someone will be here talking about Liverpool, and join us then. Thank you very much.
This is the Blood Red podcast from the Liverpool Echo, giving you the inside track on all the big talking points from Anfield.